It is the year 1944. The world is still gripped by the storm of war, and across the battlefields of Europe, the thunder of artillery shakes the earth. Yet far away from the front lines, behind guarded fences and watchtowers, a different story begins to unfold. One not of destruction, but of discovery. German medics, once trained to treat the wounded with dwindling supplies and desperate improvisations, now find themselves as prisoners of war in American camps. Here, they are about to witness something they never imagined possible in captivity. Inside the camp's medical barracks, light pours through spotless windows, illuminating shelves neatly stacked with supplies. There are rolls of fresh bandages, sterilized instruments glimmering under lamps, and cabinets filled with medicines that had become rare luxuries back home. The German medics, used to shortages and improvising with rags torn from uniforms, now stand in silent disbelief. What they are seeing is not just a prisoner's infirmary, it feels like a fully equipped hospital, built with precision and care. To them, it is more than a building. It is a revelation. For the first time, many realize that even in the custody of their former enemies, wounded men could receive treatment that rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, the standards of their own homeland. It was not only a display of resources, but also a quiet demonstration of humanity. In this moment, as scalpels gleam and morphine vials line the shelves, these medics understand that they have stepped into a world where mercy and medicine intertwine, even in war. The first impression was silence. Not the silence of fear, nor the silence of a prison cell, but the stunned quiet of men who had walked into a place they could hardly believe was real. The German medics, many of them seasoned by years on battlefields from the Eastern Front to the crumbling defenses of France, had grown accustomed to working in shadows, dark tents, barns converted into makeshift hospitals, or damp cellars littered with the stench of blood and damp earth. Their hands had long since learned the grim rhythm of improvisation. When bandages ran out, uniforms were torn into strips. When antiseptics were gone, wounds were washed with whatever liquid could be found, sometimes alcohol, sometimes even dirty water. And when morphine ran dry, they watched helplessly as young men bit down on sticks or leather straps to endure surgery. Now, in this American camp, they entered a different world. Bright light flooded the infirmary, not the flickering glow of lanterns, but steady illumination from lamps that revealed every corner, every shelf, every instrument. Their eyes darted instinctively to the details, as trained physicians and nurses often do. What they saw seemed to mock their own memories. Here, rows of sealed bandages sat neatly in boxes, not yellowed with overuse, but crisp and white, waiting to be opened. Surgical tools gleamed as though they had just been forged, each resting in its designated place on sterilized trays. Bottles of antiseptic solution stood tall in glass cabinets, their labels facing outward, their caps unbroken. There was no smell of decay, no trace of rot or dirt. Instead, the air carried the faint, sharp tang of cleanliness, the unmistakable scent of a room prepared to heal, not to endure. For the German medics, this was more than just supplies. It was a glimpse into a reality they had been denied for years. Many remembered how, back in the ruins of Europe, hospitals had been stripped bare by bombings, supply lines choked by shortages, and factories too damaged to produce what was needed. Some of them had seen entire surgeries carried out with knives so dull they could barely cut, and clamps that no longer held under pressure. They had learned to boil instruments repeatedly until metal warped, and when replacements could not be found, they adapted. Jury-rigging tools from farming equipment, carpenter's drills, or anything that might serve in desperate hands. Here none of that was necessary. Every syringe was new, every scalpel shone, every dressing came untouched by another wound. For the medics who stood staring, it was like stepping into the future. A future where suffering could be controlled, where infection could be prevented, where dignity in treatment could be preserved. One of them, a surgeon who had operated on dozens of men with nothing but makeshift equipment, felt his throat tighten as he studied the table before him. He recalled with painful clarity the screams of soldiers whose flesh he had stitched without anesthesia. He remembered the feverish stares of the wounded, whose infections spread because they could not be cleaned properly. Now, looking at rows of iodine bottles and rows of gauze rolls, he wondered if those men might have lived, if only they had had this, another medic, younger but already marked by the exhaustion of war, stepped closer to a cabinet and pressed his hand against the glass. Behind it lay packets of surgical gloves, still folded, still sealed. In Germany, gloves had become a luxury almost unknown by 1944. Surgeons often operated bare-handed, scrubbing as best they could, but knowing that bacteria still clung beneath their fingernails. Many operations were done in dim light, the medics' hands trembling from exhaustion, their uniforms already soaked with the sweat and blood of the day. Infection was not the exception but the rule, a grim certainty that hovered over every patient. To see these gloves, dozens, perhaps hundreds, waiting in perfect order was more than astonishing. It was heartbreaking. And then there were the medicines: morphine, sulfur drugs, antipyretics, bottles of aspirin, tins of disinfectant powder. In Europe, these had become items to be rationed with cruelty, saved only for the officers, the men of rank, or the rare case that might survive if treated immediately. The rest were left to fate. But here, in an American camp, the shelves sagged under their weight. The German medics exchanged glances that said what words could not. This was wealth beyond imagining, and not in gold or silver, but in life itself. They could not help but think back to their last days on the field before capture. Some had carried medical satchels so empty they might as well have been pouches of stone. They remembered arguing over who would receive the last vial of morphine, or whether to risk wasting a final roll of bandages on a man unlikely to survive. The bitterness of those choices had scarred them more deeply than the war itself. To walk into this American infirmary was to confront the weight of those memories, magnified by the sight of abundance they had never known. The silence in the room stretched long, heavy, with unspoken thoughts. Pride, shame, awe, even anger, all swirled within them. They were prisoners now, stripped of command, stripped of uniform, but in this place they felt something else stripped away as well, the illusion that their nation's power had been absolute. For here was proof that America's strength was not only in its tanks and planes, but in its ability to supply even its prisoners with what their own soldiers had been denied. It was a power measured not in destruction, but in preservation. Some of the medics, standing quietly by the door, thought of the men they had lost in the chaos of retreat, comrades who might have lived if they had been treated in a place like this. Others thought of the wounded still lying in crumbling hospitals across Germany, where nurses cut rags into makeshift dressings and prayed for supplies that would never arrive. Here, in the heart of their enemy's camp, stood the cruelest paradox of all. The Germans' wounded comrades would have been safer as prisoners than as soldiers on their own soil. As the German medics lingered, some with trembling hands, some with hollow stares, they realized they were not only looking at supplies, they were looking at a philosophy, a testament to a belief that even enemies deserved dignity in suffering. The abundance was shocking, yes, but it was the intention behind it that shook them most. The German medics quickly realized that abundance alone was not the most striking feature of the American camp hospitals. What gripped them just as strongly was the sense of order, the discipline that guided every action, every procedure. It was not the frantic patchwork chaos they had come to associate with wartime medicine. No, this was something else. Something colder, more exact, yet strangely comforting. The first time they were allowed to observe a treatment, they noticed the quiet choreography unfolding before them. A wounded prisoner was carried in, his face pale, his uniform torn. The American medical staff did not hesitate, nor did they descend into confusion. Every movement was deliberate. The stretcher was placed in the same position as those before it, the instruments already laid out in a specific order, the attending physician consulting notes that seemed to predict what would be needed next. There was no shouting, no desperate improvisation, no scramble for missing equipment. It was not a battlefield, but a performance of precision. The German medics exchanged glances, unspoken questions written in their eyes. Back home, their work had been frantic. They had often been forced to improvise with tools that were missing or broken, medicines they did not have, records that had been destroyed by shelling or lost in retreats. Too often, treatments depended not on training or knowledge, but on whatever happened to be at hand. But here, nothing was left to chance. The Americans kept meticulous records. Every soldier's name, rank, wound, and treatment was carefully written in neat, legible handwriting. Dosages were logged, follow-up checks scheduled, outcomes tracked with exacting discipline. One German medic, who had often scribbled notes in the margins of blood-stained scraps of paper while shells exploded nearby, stared at these organized logbooks as though they were holy relics. He knew what it meant. In this place, medicine was not merely survival, it was a science conducted with care and foresight, not panic. The operating tables themselves were prepared as if by ritual. Stainless steel trays gleamed with instruments laid out in symmetrical order, each one in its place. Bandages were unfolded in advance, scissors placed beside them, clamps waiting in perfect alignment. The German medics had spent years setting up makeshift surgeries in muddy barns, where tools lay scattered and assistants scrambled to find what was missing in the critical moment. Here there was no scrambling. Everything was where it was supposed to be, because someone had thought ahead. They also saw something deeper, something that unnerved them. The Americans treated everyone the same. The wounded German prisoner received the same careful examination, the same supplies, and the same steady attention as the American soldier who had carried him in. The German medics, standing at the back of the infirmary, watched in disbelief as enemy and friend alike were tended with equal diligence. There was no hesitation, no withholding of resources for their own men only. It was as though the very idea of triage had been redefined, not by rank, not by allegiance, but by need. For men raised in a system that often valued hierarchy above humanity, this was difficult to process. They remembered how supplies had often been hoarded for officers or political elites, while the ordinary soldier received what little remained. They remembered how wounded civilians were sometimes overlooked entirely, because the military came first. Yet here, a prisoner of war, a man who only weeks earlier may have been firing at American troops, was treated with a quiet dignity that left the German medics unsettled. One of them, a nurse who had spent years in undersupplied field hospitals, could not take his eyes off the American orderly who carefully changed a prisoner's bandage. The process was methodical. The old dressing removed and documented, the wound cleaned, antiseptic applied, and fresh gauze layered with precision. Nothing was wasted, nothing rushed. The German nurse thought of the countless times he had been forced to tear one bandage into three, each strip too small to cover what it should, each strip doomed to fail within hours. He thought of the men who had died because of it. And now, in front of him, a prisoner received more care than many of his comrades had ever known. The atmosphere in the infirmary carried its own kind of discipline. Voices were calm, movements restrained, footsteps measured. American medical staff moved with the quiet efficiency of people who trusted both their training and their resources. There was no air of desperation, no sense that supplies might run out at any moment. That alone was a profound difference. Desperation had defined the German medics' work. Every procedure had been haunted by the knowledge that this vial, this tool, this bandage might be the last one for weeks. In contrast, the Americans operated with the confidence of abundance, and that confidence produced order. For the German medics, it was not only a revelation, but also a wound to their pride. They had been trained to think of themselves as disciplined, methodical, efficient, the embodiment of order in medicine. Yet standing here, watching American staff work, they realized their own discipline had been an illusion, constantly shattered by shortages and chaos. True order was not a matter of will alone. True order required the means to sustain it. The Americans had those means, and it showed in every record, every clean table, every carefully logged wound. Some of the medics found themselves drawn to the logbooks more than the instruments. They flipped through the pages when allowed, running their fingers across the ink as if trying to understand how such order could exist in the middle of war. Each patient had a history here. No one was lost to memory or forgotten in the tide of casualties. That alone was shocking. In Europe, entire units had disappeared in chaos, their wounded left unnamed, their deaths unrecorded. To the Germans, the idea that even prisoners' medical histories were preserved felt almost unreal. In the quiet of those American infirmaries, they confronted an uncomfortable truth. War might reduce men to enemies, but order and discipline in medicine elevated them back to human beings. Every neat line in those records, every carefully folded dressing, was a reminder that even the defeated could still be treated with respect. For some of the German medics, it was an unbearable thought. For others, it was a seed, an idea that medicine could be something more than the shadow of war, something that demanded order, not for the sake of efficiency alone, but for the sake of life itself. And so, as they returned to their quarters, their minds heavy with the images they had witnessed, they carried with them a mixture of emotions: admiration for the skill they had seen, shame for the chaos they had lived through, and an uneasy respect for the discipline of their captors. For perhaps the greatest revelation was not the supplies themselves, but the way those supplies were used, with care, with patience, and with an order that refused to discriminate between friend and foe. What struck the German medics most deeply was not only the abundance of supplies or the precision of the American system. It was the spirit behind it all, the philosophy that seemed to govern every action in those camp hospitals. They had expected, perhaps even accepted, the idea that as prisoners they would be treated as less than human. They had braced themselves for neglect, for contempt, for the bare minimum of medical care. Instead, what they found was something that unsettled them far more, a quiet, unwavering sense of compassion. At first, they could hardly believe what they were seeing. A German prisoner, his leg torn by shrapnel, was laid on the table. The American doctor did not sneer or speak with disdain. He gave instructions calmly, his team moving in rhythm. Anesthesia was prepared, not withheld. The wound was cleaned with antiseptic, stitched with precision, and bandaged with fresh gauze. Every step was careful, deliberate, carried out with the same diligence that would have been given to an American soldier. The German medics standing nearby felt a heaviness in their chests. They had seen too many comrades left to die because supplies had run out, or because their worth had been measured against rank or nationality. Here the only measure seemed to be humanity itself. Meals for the recovering wounded revealed the same philosophy. The German medics watched as prisoners were served soft bread, broth and fruits, foods meant not only to fill the stomach, but to strengthen the body. In their homeland, recovery diets had all but vanished. Scarcity dictated that even the healthiest men lived on little more than potatoes or thin soups. The idea of serving fresh, nutritious food to a prisoner recovering from surgery seemed almost absurd by comparison. Yet in these American camps, it was standard practice. Prisoners were not starved or humiliated, but given what was needed to heal. It was more than mercy. It was a statement. The German medics could not help but reflect on the contrast. In their minds flickered the images of field hospitals back home, overcrowded rooms where wounded soldiers lay 3 to a bed, the air thick with infection, the food rations so meager that men wasted away before their wounds could heal. Supplies were hoarded for those deemed most valuable, while ordinary soldiers often faded quietly into death. And civilians, women, children, the elderly, were too often left to fend for themselves, their suffering eclipsed by the war machine's endless hunger. To see their own wounded comrades in captivity treated with more dignity than many of their free countrymen had ever known was a truth that struck them like a hammer. Some of the medics felt shame burning in their veins. How could it be that their enemy, the very force that had captured them, showed more compassion to the wounded than their own system had shown at home. Others felt anger, though they could not decide at whom, at their leaders for failing them, at themselves for participating in a broken machine, or at the Americans for exposing their inadequacies so plainly. Yet beneath the shame and anger was something more dangerous, a stirring sense of respect, even admiration. It was a realization that strength could be shown not only in firepower, but in the ability to preserve life, even the lives of enemies. The philosophy was not spoken aloud by the American doctors. They did not lecture or boast. They simply acted, and in their actions, the philosophy became undeniable. Medicine here was not a weapon, not a tool of propaganda or an extension of cruelty. It was a duty, a commitment to a principle that transcended nationality. A wound was a wound, and it deserved care. A life was a life, and it was worth preserving. The German medics observed quietly, but they could not avoid the way these moments unsettled the foundations of what they had believed. They had been told that compassion was weakness, that mercy for the enemy was foolish. They had been trained to see medicine as a necessity of war, not as a universal obligation. Yet here, in these prison camp hospitals, they saw another way. They saw that compassion could be stronger than hatred, and that the true measure of power lay not only in the ability to destroy, but in the willingness to heal. For some of them, these experiences would become haunting memories. They would return to their bunks at night, unable to sleep, replaying the sight of a German prisoner being stitched under proper anesthesia, wondering how many men they themselves had lost for lack of such care. They would remember the taste of the recovery meals they had watched being served, simple but nourishing, and think of the wasted, starving men who had died under their watch. They would wrestle with the realization that the ideals they had been taught were not as absolute as they had believed. For others, these memories would become seeds, fragile but persistent. Seeds of doubt about the system they had served. Seeds of curiosity about whether medicine could exist apart from politics and war. Seeds of longing for a world where healing was not rationed by ideology. They did not say these thoughts aloud. Pride and fear kept them silent. But deep within, something had shifted. The German medics had entered the camp hospitals expecting to see their captors' cruelty. Instead, they had seen their captors' humanity, and in that revelation lay both pain and possibility. Pain, because it revealed the failures of their own system. Possibility, because it suggested that even in war, a different way of being was possible. As they stood in silence, watching another prisoner receive treatment, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and the steady rhythm of calm voices, they felt the weight of an undeniable truth. The true strength of a nation was not measured only in bombs or bullets. It was measured in moments like this, in the willingness to treat even the defeated with dignity. That realization would stay with them, etched into memory long after the war was over.